On a scorching summer day, after bringing the cows home from pasture, Paul and Steve decided to go to the lake for a swim. Steve, however, hesitated, not knowing if his father would let him go to the lake, as there was a lot of work to do in the garden. To his relief, his father allowed him to go, but reminded him to weed the garden after swimming. Paul volunteered to help his friend. Encouraged and excited, they set off for the lake. After running a couple dozen yards, Paul suggested they stop at the barn to pick apples. As they approached the barn and Paul went inside, Steve lingered by the door, leaning against the frame. While Paul gathered apples into his pockets, Steve looked around. The barn was an ordinary barn, with a cow lying in the corner on a bed of last year's straw, chewing its cud rhythmically. Steve's attention was attracted by a strange colored object about the size of a hat lying next to the cow's udder. He even thought it was moving. Looking closer, he was stunned to see a huge frog attached to the cow's udder. Greedily smacking its lips, the frog fixed its gaze on Steve, who froze with fear and disgust. The frog's lumpy, wart-covered dark brown skin resembled the bark of an old oak tree, and its bulging eyes resembled crocodile eyes. With a loud cry, Steve ran out of the barn. Paul tried to ask Steve what had frightened him, but he mumbled incoherently, pointing to the barn door. Finally realizing that there was someone in the barn, Paul cautiously stepped inside. "What frightened you in here?" he asked his friend. "A cow, a cow," Steve muttered. "Look at the udder, look at the udder." Finally Paul saw it. The frog was still sitting in its spot, not even trying to hide. "You witch!" exclaimed Paul indignantly, grabbed the stick from the corner, deftly smashed the frog, and threw it out of the barn. "Beat the witch!" shrilled Paul, and began feverishly pounding the frog with the stick. One of the blows turned the frog over on its back. It was lying belly up, awkwardly wiggling its legs. Blood oozed from its open mouth, red blood. "Steve, look, blood!" shouted Paul. "She really is a witch. Beat her." Steve's courage returned to him and he grabbed another stick. Joining Paul, it felt like they were hitting a rubber ball. The frog continued to wriggle, trying to roll over onto its belly. Realizing that hitting the frog with the sticks was useless, Paul rushed into the barn and, armed with a pitchfork, leapt toward the frog. Raising the pitchfork high above his head, he plunged it sharply into the frog. The frog wriggled for a few moments, but then fell silent, with only red blood still oozing from the wound. "Well, that's it. The witch is finished," said Paul, and leaving the pitchfork and sticks in the barn, the boys ran to the lake. After a swim, the boys headed home, almost forgetting about the morning's confrontation. They only remembered it when they approached Paul's house. "Hey," Paul said to his friend, "let's go see what happened to the frog." As they approached the barn, the boys were surprised to find that the frog was missing from its usual spot. After looking for her for a while, the friends headed home. Steve awoke to a loud knocking on the window. For a while he lay still, catching his breath, trying to figure out who it could be. While Steve was pondering, the door to the house opened and his father, awakened by the noise, let out a loud shriek. Standing on the threshold was Paul's mother, disheveled and sobbing. It was clear from her rambling account that her son Paul had died a few minutes ago. Nothing that evening foreshadowed such a tragic outcome. After supper, mother and son were preparing for bed when someone knocked softly on the window. Paul's mother went to the window, gazed into the darkness for a few moments, but saw no one. "Are you going to town tomorrow?" An unfamiliar female voice asked from the darkness. No. Barely had Paul's mother uttered the word when the terrified cry of her son made her turn around. Her son, who until a moment ago had been alive and well, was now lying on the floor. Wild pain contorted his body, his hands nervously tugging at his clothes. Her son was dying, and his mother stood there, horrified, unable to help him. Paul was dying before her eyes. In addition to Paul's death, another event shocked the villagers the next morning. There was an old woman in the village whom everyone thought was a witch, called her an otter behind her back, and tried to avoid her as much as possible. The morning after Paul's death, a rumor spread through the village that the otter had stabbed herself so hard with a pitchfork in her shed that she had pierced herself through with 3 times. In addition, she had cut her lips. Another person would have died on the spot, but not she. She recovered, though she stopped leaving the house.